one idea. Another idea is dumping a kind of iron slurry into the ocean, which would stimulate plankton bloom, which suck up carbon out of the surface waters of the ocean and then would eventually, in theory, sequester it deep in the ocean. So that's one technology. The other is technologies that block sunlight away from the Earth. These are the ones that can be deployed fairly quickly and fairly cheaply. And they're essentially like putting a kind of sun parasol over the planet. And what's interesting is that you don't need to reflect away very much sunlight to have a big impact. If you can reflect away just like 1 to 2%, you can essentially offset the temperature rise of a doubling of CO2 emissions, which is a common benchmark that scientists use. And there are two ways to do this that are most commonly talked about, and I think the most serious proposals. One is to put tiny particles high up in the stratosphere at around 60,000 feet or something, perhaps made of sulfur or other compounds that would essentially act like tiny mirrors floating around up in the stratosphere that would reflect sunlight away. And the other one is to brighten marine clouds, to change the reflectivity of clouds over parts of the ocean. And you could do that by spraying tiny droplets of salt water basically up into these marine clouds, which would make them whiter and reflect away more sunlight.
All right, well, let's talk about one of these ideas, and that's this idea which you call doping the stratosphere, where millions, I guess billions of tiny particles are launched high above the surface of the Earth, and I guess in particular over the Arctic, so as to shield some sunlight, reflect more sunlight, and lower the temperature. Who's working on this kind of stuff?
Well, it's being explored by a number of people. I mean, it's the impacts of this are being explored by a number of climate modelers. One of them is Ken Caldera at the Carnegie Institution on the Stanford University campus, who's a very well-known climate modeler. So people like him are looking at what the impact of these particles would be on the planet if you inject them into the stratosphere, and at what the impact would be on the Arctic. Because one of the concerns right now is we know that the warming on the planet is happening most quickly in the Arctic and at the poles. And so there's a question of, well, if we saw that the Arctic was starting to melt even more quickly than it is now, and that would mean, of course, sea level rise and many other consequences, what could we do to stop it? Is there a way that we could stop the melt of the Arctic? And one of the ways is to put these particles in the stratosphere. And we also have engineers looking at it, because one of the issues is, of course, how do you do this? How do you put these particles up there? And some scientists like David Keith at the University of Calgary are looking into using high-altitude airplanes to essentially spray a sulfur gas into the high into the atmosphere that would create these little particles. Other ideas that have been looked at are using a kind of hose that would be anchored in the stratosphere by a high-altitude balloon that would essentially allow this stuff to be pumped up into the stratosphere.
So this would be a hose that would be miles long and extend down to the ground?
Yeah. And it sounds implausible, and it's probably not the most likely way to do this. I think that most people who take this seriously are looking at aircraft as the most likely sort of delivery mechanism. But this idea of this, hose held aloft, it's essentially, an artificial volcano. It's an artificial high-altitude volcano that would pump these little particles high up into the stratosphere. And from a physics point of view, it's doable. The amount of particles you have to put up into the stratosphere is actually quite small. But there's, of course, many issues about holding this thing aloft and actually working out the technical bits of it. But there are even people, in fact, the National Academy of Sciences, when they looked into this a couple of decades ago, even talked about you could put this stuff up with artillery, using artillery shells to shoot this into the stratosphere. That's sort of a low-tech way of doing it, but it is possible.
So let's just talk about sending airplanes up with all of these particles. Where do we get the particles? What are they made of? how many airplanes do you send up there? And then how do they get it out? Do they just shoot it out with little propulsion guns? What happens?
Well, there's lots of different ideas about how you might do this. One of the ideas that is David Keith at University of Calgary is exploring is using a kind of high altitude aircraft that the military and others have designed that is specifically for high altitude research, and actually bringing up canisters of sulfuric acid, which sounds quite horrific, but really isn't, given the small amounts that are required. And you spray, it would essentially release the gas out of the wings of the airplane, and it would create, through a chemical reaction in the atmosphere, create these small particles that would then stay aloft in the stratosphere for, about a year or something around that neighborhood. And one of the complicating things about this is that it's a virtue and a kind of liability, is that these particles fall out and they don't stay there forever. So on one level, that's a good thing because it's reversible. If we do it and we start to see real consequences, then we could stop. But one of the problems is, as what one scientist calls the sword of Damocles problem, which is that if we start doing this, and if we actually do use this to cool off the planet, and if we've been doing it for 10 or 20 or 30 years, and we don't reduce CO2 emissions, the CO2 will continue to build up, which acts like an insulating blanket. And if we ever did stop putting these particles up, we would have an enormous rebound in the Earth's temperature. It would be like closing an umbrella or a parasol on the beach. All of a sudden, you would have this real warming. So if we actually did do this, we would be committing ourselves to this, and that is a real issue that people have to think about. Emissions in dealing with global warming in the what many would think of as the conventional way of what we're trying to do now by cutting emissions through reducing our use of coal and fossil fuels.
One more thing. If we did adopt this strategy of putting particles into the upper atmosphere and effectively shielded some sunlight and effectively cooled the planet, would the sky look different to us?
It would, and that's a really interesting question, because it's pretty clear that if we did put these particles up there, they would change the way the light hits the planet slightly, and the sky would be a little bit paler during the day, and the sunsets would be a little bit brighter, as they are, people have seen sometimes when there's a dust storm or something, the particles tend to reflect more light. So we have paler skies and brighter sunsets. And is that something how would people react to that? And I've thought about that a lot, and I don't really know how we would react to that. I think, we see variability in the sky all the time. We look up and sometimes it's a bright blue and we remark on that. And sometimes we look up and it's almost white and we remark on that. So there's lots of variability in the sky anyway. Would how we feel about that change if we knew there was a human hand behind that? If we knew that the sky is a whiter color today because they're up there now spraying the particles? Would it change the way we feel about our life here on Earth? Would we think about ourselves kind of living in essentially a big terrarium where instead of looking up and seeing the blue sky of nature, we look up and see the blue sky of human engineers? I don't know.
Let's talk about one other approach, and that is fertilizing the ocean with iron.
Well, in a very broad sense, what we're really talking about is building a thermostat for the Earth's climate. It's about figuring out a way to cool things down if we need to, but it's also a way of thinking about what kind of climate we want to live in. One of the questions here is who we are when we talk about we want to live in this, because obviously, just as there is with global warming, there will be winners and losers with global warming. The Russians would like the Arctic to melt so they can get to the oil up there, and many northern latitudes will see increase in agricultural production, perhaps. But there will also be significant losers in global warming, and it's the same is true with geoengineering. There will be winners and losers, and one of the tricky things about geoengineering is that it's a deliberate, conscious decision. We will have to decide, well, what kind of climate do we want to live in? How much warming do we want to deal with? And right now, we're just kind of letting it go, and we're saying nature is going to decide how much the Arctic melts and things like that. But geoengineering really injects this level of consciousness into this, and so it injects a lot of questions about, okay, well, do we, the rich people who are of the Western world, are we the ones who are going to decide what the climate should be like, and how do we include thoughts and the benefits and losses to people in, say, the Sahel or in Africa, in various parts of Africa, and the consequences to them? How do their voices get into this conversation? How do we do this in a fair and equitable way, and is that even possible?
As you've spent time, looking into these technologies and talking to people who research them and think about their consequences, I wonder if it's made you think differently about our relationship to the planet.
Well, it has. I started this thinking about this, as anyone does, when I heard about the idea of geoengineering, as just a crazy idea. And of course, maybe the purest expression I know of sort of human hubris and technological hubris. But over the course of looking into this and meeting the scientists who were involved and thinking more deeply about this, I've actually come to see that there's advantages, that to be more optimistic about where this might lead us. I think that I've come to the conclusion that the biggest problem we face right now is not technological hubris, but human apathy. That the big risk we run right now is that we are not doing anything. We are talking a good game. We are holding conferences about green and clean technology. We're building websites about it. We're giving speeches about it, but we're not doing anything. And I think that there's something to be gained from this sort of active engagement with the climate and with nature. And one of the most powerful things I think about geoengineering is that it forces us to have a explicit discussion about what kind of world we want to live in. It forces us to say, you know what, we are now in control of what our world is going to be like. And we have to have a conversation about this. We have to have discussion about maybe we don't want to do geoengineering, and maybe we don't want to cut emissions. Maybe we just want to warm the planet and ride it out. Maybe. And maybe we want to not do geoengineering and put all of our efforts behind CO2, and maybe we make a collective decision about that. But we need to make this more explicit. And I think that one of the virtues of this is that it does that. It says we as humans are in control now. What are we going to do about it?
Well, Jeff Goodall, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Jeff Goodall spoke with Fresh Air contributor Dave Davies. Goodall's new book is called How to Cool the Planet. You can read an excerpt on our website, freshair.npr.org, where you'll also find links to previous Fresh Air interviews with Jeff Goodall about the coal industry and the politics of climate change.